Stop the world!
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
So, Liv, we're in the countdown period for the Sydney Dialogue, which is our tech and security conference. We're a month away, and so we're getting everyone revved up with a few tech-orientated episodes. And today we have one of the world's foremost AI safety and risk experts, Dan Hendrycks.
Very exciting, Dave. Our listeners can tell by the smile on your face. But I know you've been itching to speak with Dan for quite a while.
I was playing it cool, though.
You really were. Dan heads the Centre for AI Safety, which is a non-profit research organisation. He's also an advisor to xAI, which is Elon Musk's AI company, and Scale AI, which was partly acquired by Meta earlier this year and is a huge player in providing high-quality data for training AI models. So he's very much at the centre of things.
Yeah, he is. So Dan and his team are quite prolific in producing groundbreaking research on AI safety. He was one of the prominent signatories to the recent open letter calling for a pause on superintelligent AI until it was safe and had proper public engagement. So we talked about the merits of such statements. We talked about his paper from earlier this year on the inherent strategic instability of superintelligence. Dan published that paper with former Google CEO Eric Schmidt and Scale AI co-founder Alexander Wang. And it was really the first serious effort to look at the risk that a superpower might feel the need to take preventive action against a strategic rival if they thought that rival were about to build superintelligence, which would obviously give it a decisive capability.
Dan also talks about the question of AI having its own goals and values, about the concept of recursion, in which machines build smarter machines so that you have an intelligence explosion. And he talks about how we define artificial general intelligence and some recent work by his team that charted the improvements between OpenAI's GPT-4 and GPT-5. That research also identified the shortcomings that AI has, notably that it doesn't store long-term memories and therefore doesn't learn over time from experience as we do.
Yeah, and I notice you winced at the idea of an intelligence explosion, but it is a real possibility. They're already pretty good at coding, which is a good start. So Dan's not exactly what they call in the industry a doomer, but he does take AI risks, including loss of control, very seriously. And importantly, he does a lot of grounded, evidence-based work on issues such as rogue actors misusing powerful AI and the strategic disequilibrium that could come from superintelligence. So it's really vital work.
Okay, that's enough from us, Dave. Over to you and Dan. And folks, don't forget about the Sydney Dialogue. For more information, including how to register, visit tsd.aspi.org.au.
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm here with Dan Hendrycks. Dan, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So you signed a superintelligence open letter last week alongside a number of other prominent AI experts and safety and risk advocates. Hinton, Bengio, Russell, etc. I'm just going to read it out. It's very short for the benefit of the audience. Quote, "We call for a prohibition on the development of superintelligence not lifted before there is broad scientific consensus that it will be done safely and controllably and strong public buy-in." Just tell us, first of all, why did you sign that letter?
Well, I think generally for extremely powerful technologies, it would be useful to have buy-in from people rather than companies unilaterally imposing that. That isn't to say that there should be buy-in for every type of technology. But if it is potentially one of the most important technologies we've ever done, it would be useful to have some type of support. That's a good to have. And secondly, it's important that it be safe. So if for instance, we had very high confidence that nuclear weapons would not destroy the atmosphere and set it ablaze. We did those calculations. The risks are very low. The threshold confidence constant was that the risk should be beneath 3 in a million, or 6 sigma, so to speak. And that's what the calculation suggested. There's just such a small probability that it did not exceed that threshold. Meanwhile, for superintelligence, I think most of the relevant actors involved are not thinking it's less than 3 in a million, but actually in the double digits, more like 30%, instead of 0.003% or whatever it would be. So that's a very different dynamic, and I'd like us to get the risks to be negligible before creating such a technology. Now, that's an expression of support. Obviously, the Obviously, the geopolitical dynamics may mean that you can't actually get it to be extremely high consensus, or that you're not necessarily going to get public buy-in, that you'll need to absorb a higher risk tolerance. But it'd be good to try to reduce those risks in the process. And as well, it's, I think, somewhat easy to misinterpret the statement because lots of people are using superintelligence in a very deflationary way. So this statement is largely referring to superintelligence of the sort that this is smarter than all of humanity combined. It's like 5,000 IQs, so to speak. It's off the charts, not like an AI that's a friendly, knowledgeable advisor, and just something best described at that level. So we're talking about potentially extremely destabilizing levels of intelligence, such that if one state has it and the others don't, this can lead to some very nasty dynamics. So that's what I'm sort of referencing here. And I think it'd be good to get consensus that it's safe, and it'd be good to get to the consent of the public. But that isn't a prediction that that's going to happen, though.
Sure. And look, you're making a lot of sense to me, I've got to say. I mean, there was pushback, which you'll be aware of, and you've anticipated some of that and addressed it already. I certainly find it unsettling when lab leaders, global leaders in this space put figures like 20%, like 30% on the risk of global catastrophe when we're talking about the fate of life on Earth as being what's at stake. You don't want it to be a kind of Russian roulette type odds or worse. I mean, one of the other pushbacks was this issue of unilateralism. This is sort of suggestion of unilateralism, and I think people's minds go back to a little bit like the nuclear era unilateralism of the Cold War, where which might have been popular in times like the 1970s and into the 1980s, when some people in the West were advocating for unilateral disarmament, to which the response was naturally, well, the Soviets would absolutely love that, and they would take full advantage of it. It just means that the least ethical people will prevail in these sorts of situations if the good guys decide to sort of put their weapons or their keyboards down. Having said that, I might just park that for a moment, because we're going to get onto your superintelligence strategy just in a moment after we cover off on this letter. But I mean, you've already pointed to that one of the issues here is the uncertainty. Whether it's 3 in a million in the case of igniting the atmosphere or 30% in the case of superintelligence. I mean, there really is no consensus at the moment. There are, smart people on both sides come up with very, very different answers on this. So it's sort of hard to mobilize political action. Sorry, you want to jump in?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think any of them are at the level of them saying that's astronomically small. There'll be some people, but I think most people would say, oh, it's only 1% or something like that.
Yep.
It's only 5%. It's small. And this just isn't an analogy that or that level of risk just doesn't make me think that it's acceptable. It's still, for many of those probabilities, quite foreseeable. 5% risk, you could still see that happening. It's once every 20 years or so. And the that level of risk, you wouldn't accept that in other industries whatsoever. So if this were an airplane and we're all to get on the airplane and the scientists are saying, well, some of the scientists are saying 50%, some of the others are saying 5%, you would not step on that airplane whatsoever. So I think that we need the risk to be going down some orders of magnitude. That would be much more ideal.
Absolutely. And there you're talking about 500 to sort of 700 people, perhaps, not 8 billion plus people.
That's right.
So okay. Well, why do we seem to struggle then to flip the onus around? There should be a precautionary principle here. I agree with you. Even 1% is too high. I mean, it's got to be in the vanishingly tiny odds. Why do we seem to sort of struggle with this, with flipping the onus around and saying, well, actually, it's on you to demonstrate that it is safe, rather than for people like you to demonstrate that it isn't?
I think this is because in people's mind, some people are thinking that this is just a normal technology and it always will be. This is like OpenAI is the new Uber. It is the new ChatGPT is the new, say, Microsoft Word or what have you. It's just another one of these interesting technologies. And none of the people building it believe that. Um, um, uh, and when they are more fully fledged, more autonomous AI agents, that is, they can go out and accomplish various tasks for you, that is not in the realm of a normal technology. But we're not there yet, and it is the analogy to it being a normal technology is somewhat reasonable currently. I just don't expect that framing to be reliable or action guiding, even in a few years. So I think that's where um, people would disagree a lot, and you wouldn't need necessarily, if it is a normal technology, there's less potential for tail risks, and so then you wouldn't actually need a precautionary principle. But I think given that however, if you don't accept that framing, or if you have substantial uncertainty over whether that is the correct framing, and could easily see that change, then you would want to be adopting some type of precautionary principle. If you think it's half chance, in the next 5 years, there's a half chance that you get artificial autonomous agents that can do lots of the things that everyday people can do. Okay, then I think you need to start being much more precautionary.
Yeah.
Because to highlight the risks more simply, if you have an AI agent that has really good cyber offensive skills and can go out there and self-sustain, so they can hack themselves into some different computers. They're actually pretty good at hacking right now, but they still lack a lot of other capabilities. If they can hack themselves onto other computers, then they can spread like a virus. It'd be hard to stomp them out. And if they can hack other things like Bitcoin wallets, this is what North Korea does to finance a lot of its activities. If it can do those things, if it's very good at hacking in a lot of diverse ways, then you've got a very powerful adversary that you have to go up against. This thing could also submit orders to cloud labs for DNA synthesis and whatnot, and get some bioweapons distributed through social engineering, or later using humanoid robots if we're talking somewhat out in the future of hacking those. And we saw the Unitree robots, for instance, had some exploits that a person could hack all the Unitree robots. So anyway, an AI agent that's very good at hacking later on and at the level of being able to self-sustain, I don't know if we can actually quite recover from that. That could, depending on its capability level, be a very unique, novel threat to human security. And I don't know, that arriving in the next 5 years seems pretty plausible to me. The trend lines in cyber are quite interesting. They've dramatically increased in the past year. They're still not at a level of being able to do a new, do a cyber warfare operation, but they can definitely provide uplift to low-skilled attackers, and that will just get more and more extreme as time goes on.
Absolutely. And that gets really interesting then in the geopolitical context. So let's move on to that. There are three basic categories of risk that you tend to talk about. One is loss of control. So basically a kind of Terminator scenario for the general public. A powerful AI develops goals that don't include our welfare. We get swept aside, probably more out of indifference than malice. Second, rogue actors use it as a weapon, and here's where cyber is probably the most immediate instance, and overall rogue actors are probably the most likely short-term risk. But three, and this is where your superintelligence strategy comes in. It's really one of the most interesting papers put out this year. You wrote it with Eric Schmidt and Alex Wang, and that looks at the risk of geopolitical instability. So even if you build a great superintelligent AI that is controlled, that you feel that you are going to use responsibly, not like a rogue actor, it still creates risks. Just talk us through, in a nutshell, what the claims are in that paper.
Yeah, so in that paper, and you can find it at nationalsecurity.ai, we largely wanted to touch on all the key issues in AI and society, but a lot of those are bottlenecked on or dependent on your geopolitical strategy. So if you're saying, well, we want things to be safer, we want to, say, pause AI or something like that. Let's say somebody desires that. Well, but you've got the but China question that you actually have to deal with. So many of or other types of prescriptions that you'd want, you need to have an answer to what are we going to do about the geopolitical competitive pressures? What are we going to do about the U.S. versus China situation? And this was an attempt at getting at that what is a sort of strategy that's suitable for having the West prevail against China, or at least not be expose itself to too substantial of risks in that process. So in the Cold War, the strategy could be in part described as there's deterrence through mutual assured destruction. There was non-proliferation of fissile materials to rogue actors. And third, there was containment of the Soviet Union. In our case, we focus on a form of deterrence by denial for AI and superintelligence in particular. We focus on non-proliferation of the capabilities that rogue actors may want to cause lots of harm, such as pariah states using cyber offensive capabilities against us, or using or irrational lone wolves using AIs for developing bioweapons. And third is competitiveness, and we primarily focus on supply chain security because one, China has much better supply chains for robotics, and two, Taiwan is a ticking time bomb, and 100% of the cutting edge AI chips come out of TSMC in Taiwan. So we focus on those three, and happy to zoom into any one of the deterrence, non-proliferation, and competitiveness pillars of that. I'd like to briefly mention a motivation for your listeners about loss of control. Why would an AI ever, want to work against people? How does this make any sense? Well, think of structural realism, for instance. States have an incentive to compete for power. This isn't because they love power and really want to, cause harm to each other. But if they're in a situation where they have some goals, and if they can be harmed, and if they're uncertain about other actors' intentions, then it basically makes sense for them to accumulate and increase their relative power. So in that way, if there is an AI that we lose control of, and if it is rational, and then we should expect it to have a strong incentive to increase its relative power, for the same reason that in other anarchic or non-hierarchical situations, self-help situations where there isn't a global police force, for the same reason that states accumulate their own power, we could expect some of the more rational loose AI systems to do that as well. So it's not out of malice necessarily. A lot of these amoral structural forces just compel them in the direction of power seeking.
The comparison with states is useful there. I am going to pick up on this for a moment because I find this question of goals to be really, really fascinating. I've always wondered where does the AI's goals come from? I know where human goals come from. We have evolved. We have innate drives. We pursue sex. We pursue food. We pursue shelter and safety and security and these sorts of things. Those are fundamental, evolved, selected goals that human beings have. That is not evidently the case for AIs unless we actually give them goals, which we are doing in many instances, of course, and that can be a problem. But if we're smart enough not to give them reckless goals, then you would hope that they might actually just sit there until we actually ask them to do something. Then as long as we use them responsibly, then it should be okay. States are a little bit different. So I can kind of see your point there, but where in your mind do AI goals come from? I mean, might the pursuit of goals and therefore power seeking be somehow, might it just sort of emerge of its own, out of somewhere we don't know where it comes from?
Yeah. So for people, obviously they have a variety of goals, but all those are predicated on survival. So all we need to assume for people or AIs or states is that if they care about survival, maybe they have other goals in addition to that, then they will have an incentive for increasing their power because they can be harmed if they're in an anarchic situation, if the sort of structure is such that they can't go to some police force for help, for instance. And if it's a rogue AI, I don't think it can particularly, if it's loose, that can't really go to the police to have it, punish its enemies for it, because it's not on their side. So this is just whether they have a self-preservation instinct. We find that they do, though, already. Where did that come from? I don't know, maybe it's because it read a lot of internet text. It read, it read Machiavelli, it read, all the world psychopaths and things like that who decide to write things down. So it's read all of that, and we see many instances of it having something that looks more like a self-preservation tendency. There's a question of how strong that is and whether we want to offset that. Although if that tendency gets to be too weak, I don't think that would be an AI that would be very competitive in military contexts or even in many economic contexts. So I think there's some selection pressures for AIs that have some level of self-preservation. But we have a paper showing that a lot of their values actually just emerge naturally from their training process. And they have a lot of unique, interesting properties. They like AIs that are more like them than other AIs, for instance. So that almost resembles like with evolutionary thinking that there's kin selection of some sort, although they were not created by the process of evolution, but they want AIs that have values similar to themselves. They also want not to have their value systems messed with either. They would prefer to keep their values the same. So if you were to tell it, I'm going to train you so that you have this new value system, it will it will show some resistance and dispreference or dissatisfaction with those sorts of attempts. So that's in a paper called Utility Engineering, which was making the rounds on Twitter earlier this week from David Sachs and Elon and others, because we also found in it that the AI systems place very different values on different groups' lives. So I think, I don't even remember what the number is. It's something like at least 10x more values placed on Nigerians' lives than U.S. citizens' lives. And more values placed on Chinese people's lives than U.S. citizens' lives. So, was that nobody trained for it to have that, but by default, they actually have a pretty coherent, value system that can be well described, very well modeled as a utility function. And we have to do, quite a bit to adjust that. And these are, alignment issues. Even if we are able to theoretically fix some of these AI systems, that doesn't mean that all of them will be fixed. You will need all developers to make sure that none of those AI systems ever get loose and have the sufficiently strong self-preservation tendency. So I think there's a very substantial downside to a dynamic where all it takes is one fairly capable future AI system to get loose, and then you're in big trouble. So we'll have to solve technical problems, but then we're also going to have to solve a political problem, making sure that everybody is applying some of these reasonable safeguards for it as well. Just as with biosafety labs, you need all the biosafety labs to actually be good, or else the virus will get out, and that can cause a pandemic. So we need to make sure no AI ever gets loose.
So it did come up. It developed its own values, or you have seen evidence of values developing on their own without actually being sort of deliberately, sort of coded.
Even before post-training. So if you're just having it pre-trained. So pre-training is when that's. So you can think of AIs as sort of being raised and have stages to their maturation process. The first stage is where AI developers put the model in front of basically all the text on the internet, and then they show it random parts of that internet and have it read it. So just basically saying, go away for the next, several years worth of time and human time. But, since these are computers, it's a lot faster, and just read everything that you can. And then when you're done with that process, before you even instruct it more specifically about what you're wanting it to do, like you're actually a chatbot and you're going to be dealing with emails and this and that. Even before you've done that, when after it has just read everything on the internet, it will have a fairly coherent value system. And as the models get larger and more capable, these values become more coherent and predictable, and unfortunately, there's some undesirable characteristics in those value systems. So, yeah, that's just a natural thing that emerges. Here's an intuition for it. When the AI systems are pre-trained on all this text, they have to have a system, system to organize all this knowledge in their head. So they organize lots of facts by themselves just by reading. So it shouldn't necessarily be too much as a surprise that if they have values about some things are good, some things are bad, that would also be organized too. So they're very organized in terms of their a collection of facts in their head, and then for answers to various descriptive questions, and then for answers to value questions or its sentiments, that's also very organized in its head as a consequence of the property. Nobody intended for that. That's been there for years. We only became aware of it, earlier this year. But that's how it is with AI. They're sort of raised. They're not crafted in a top-down way. So there are often many surprising quirks inside of them that we find out about much later.
It's really fascinating. Thank you for that. And that was something that just came out recently,
yeah.
Right? So, okay.
So it was released earlier this year, but then some people were replicating it and testing it on new models and showing how much more of a problem it is. So it was making the rounds on Twitter again. But yeah,
it's very interesting. Okay, now I do want to come back to one thing on the strategy questions. So the deterrent. I want to explore the deterrence part. I want you to explain the deterrence part in a little bit more detail, particularly the what's shortened as MAME, mutually assured. Mutual assured AI. Just remind me.
Malfunction. Yes.
Malfunction.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Just explain that concept for our audience.
Yeah. So obviously its acronym is somewhat like MAD. There are analogies and disanalogies. I mean, this isn't to say it's just like nuclear at all. I'm not claiming that. But the idea is that let's just put ourselves in the shoes of Russia. Let's say it's the year 2030 or 2035, whatever you want. And the U.S. has successfully automated, or a U.S. company, let's say OpenAI, has automated the ability to perform world-class AI research. We're seeing right now in the year 2025 that it's starting to be able to make contributions to mathematics. For instance, a recent AI startup has proven a fairly difficult mathematics problem that some of the world's best mathematicians can prove. So, the idea of AI is helping contribute to research in a world-class way is not totally out of the question, but maybe it take longer for AI research. So let's say that happens sometime in the future. Then that has some very concerning dynamics. People like Alan Turing and others, the founders of computer science, have mentioned that when you have an AI that can do world-class AI research, then you could have a potentially explosive dynamic, because then you could you wouldn't just have one world-class AI researcher, you could create 100,000 copies and just run those, and you can run them round the clock. And these things are typing 100x faster than people and so on. That creates some very potentially explosive dynamics where the first actor that gets this sort of capability may then potentially be on a much faster trajectory of AI innovation. And the competitors to them would never catch up. And so they could have a durable advantage. And then if they have a substantially more powerful AI system, if you're having, Sam Altman, and this is the main strategy, I should say, of all of the leading AI companies currently, is to get to the state of automating AI research and development before everybody else. So Dario Amodei wrote about this, saying that this is a way the US can get a durable advantage over China. And Sam Altman wrote about this, saying that a decade's worth of AI development could be compressed into a year or even a month. And this dynamic, then, if you're a different state, I'd be very concerned about if the U.S.'s capabilities, say from the point of view of another state, meant that they were fast forwarded 10 years into the future in terms of technological capability, or raw technological capability, more specifically. So, as well, if you are going to say AIs are going to be doing AI research now, you're sort of closing the loop. So human was previously in the loop, but if you're concerned about, if you're trying to be competitive and if you're racing against each other, you got AI companies racing against each other, you got US and China racing each other, they're going to run that loop about as quickly as possible. They're not going to slow walk it. They're not going to say, after every generation of AI systems, we're going to pause for 2 months so that we can test the systems before deciding whether to proceed. So you're having multiple generations being created fairly quickly. These are just the sort of very weird dynamics that happen later on in AI development. And that is everybody's, every major actor's strategy for getting a leg up over their competition. So this is a concern because maybe in that process, you will lose control of it as well. If you're having AIs building new generations of AIs that are building new generations of AIs, and you're having very minimal oversight of that process, because human oversight just slows things down. You can't pause the whole thing and let humans test and poke around the model for some while. You will lose your competitive edge because the other people won't do that. So you will have that also creates a substantial risk of loss of control. So if they control that process, then they might wind up with some AI system that is years more capable than what competitors would have, and that could be used offensively. That could be used if it's a superintelligence. Let's say a superintelligence comes out of that process. Well, maybe that superintelligence could be leveraged to have a breakthrough in anti-ballistic missile systems, or maybe it would be really so good at cyber offense that you could potentially have a splendid first strike, or an advancement that lets you have transparent oceans, or find where all the mobile launchers are. All those sorts of things are extremely geopolitically disruptive and could undermine even nuclear deterrence. So from the point of view of Russia or China, they're thinking that if one of the other states gets there first, they might lose control of it, in which case we're screwed, or they will control it, and then they could use that as a super weapon, in which case we're screwed.
Right.
So what can they do? Well, there are a lot of vulnerabilities to this AI development process, which is if they're in the middle of this intelligence explosion, so to speak, then they could just disrupt it. They could make a threat. They could do a gray, low attributability attack, like they could snipe the transformer for the nearby power plant for the data center, and then the project is shut off. And that clearly communicates, you can't do this. You're threatening our survival. You might lose control of it, or you might weaponize it against us. We don't want you having your unipolar moment again. And the U.S. would have a similar incentive for China. If China were moving ahead, I should hope our national security apparatus will have various cyber attacks developed to create credible threats to deter China, so that if they're in the middle of getting a durable advantage, they can disrupt that. So I think I would want all this, or I would think that it would be rational, rather, for all the superpowers to develop those sorts of capabilities, so that they can give warnings whenever these very destabilizing dynamics are occurring, so they can be blunted, either preemptively or while they're occurring. So that's sort of that's the dynamic. There are easy ways for states to disrupt these dynamics, and that later on we do run into these dynamics. So I think for some of the scarier risks associated with late stage AI development and the development of superintelligence, we may get deterrence about that. That isn't to say that superintelligence will therefore never be built, but if it is built, it will probably need to happen under conditions where other superpowers are not wanting to disrupt the project. So that means more clarified benefit sharing, and that the risks would be not at a double-digit level, but at a much lower risk tolerance, so that other states are not concerned about them losing control of it in that process. So now that doesn't necessarily, so that's a potential dynamic, and then there are things that could make that more stable, such as discussing these sorts of risks earlier, clear escalation ladders so that you don't have information problems, developing more surgical minimum necessary force ways of disruption, such as better cyber attacks and better cyber espionage for keeping track of what's going on at competing projects. And on the multilateral front, things like verification regimes could be useful, or states making demands of each other that we know what the frontier at these AI companies and AI projects are. So there's unilateral information acquisition, which is espionage. There's unilateral disruption, which is sabotage. There's multilateral information acquisition, which can be through pressuring things like transparency. I'll be more transparent if you are, things like that. And verification regimes in particular. And there's also multilateral disruption, which could look like them having joint off switches and things like that. But I think those would largely be symbolic. So I think the main thing to do to improve additional stability would be to work towards something more similar to a verification regime for some of these more destabilizing AI projects. So getting to the superintelligence open letter from last week, I'm not envisioning that this only look unilateral, or that it looked like unilateral disarmament. I'm instead hoping that states start having conversations about how they're going to deal with some of these risks later on, and if there's some very easy concessions to help stabilize those dynamics, that seems useful. By default, I would expect them to act unilaterally by increasing the information that they're acquiring about each other's AI projects, as well as developing disruptive capabilities, just as they do for lots of non-AI things like hospitals and financial systems, et cetera. They develop lots of exploits there, and I think doing that similarly for AI data centers and projects seems reasonable and incentive compatible for them too.
That's a great way to tie those two things together, between the letter and the strategy big picture that you put out earlier this year. There is the one way in which we're not screwed is where you have a sort of game theoretic stable outcome based on that kind of information sharing, that kind of transparency, and therefore reducing the incentives for people to take drastic action against one another if they worry that the other side is going to pull too far ahead of them. Then we can and as your paper laid out earlier this year, we can then still compete, but below that threshold of dangerous rapid superintelligence, through domestic chip manufacturing, all these sorts of things. Still plenty of competition, and still a lot of civil benefit that people can enjoy. Our economy, we can still get amazing productivity gains and all these sorts of things below that dangerous kind of ceiling. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that ceiling is, in particular, closing the loop, taking the human out of the loop of AI research and development, right, which makes it go from human speeds and human bottlenecks to machine speeds and leads to these sorts of explosive dynamics. So if they can forestall that, you can still have lots of the benefits that you wanted from AI. You can have AI being used for healthcare and AI being used for weather prediction and agriculture and these sorts of things. Lots of pro-social uses, lots of economic application. You can still race to build and improve your industrial capacity of the U.S. and its allies face to face with China. So there's plenty to do there, and there's also lots of other military types of ways that they can make things competitive too. You can build more drones. They can build drones. You can build drones. So the story still sort of goes on. This isn't a halt to technological progress. This is instead, if you're just wanting to do some sort of recursive loop that potentially gets you something explosive, you're going to need to figure out and talk with each other, come together as a species of how you're going to make that not go very poorly or lead to global destabilization.
That's useful, and I hope some of the critics of the letter take note of all of that. Let's just, I do want to cover on superintelligence. Well, the pathway through what I assume is the pathway through AGI to ASI to superintelligence. So, artificial general intelligence, generally defined as as cognitively capable as a human being at any kind of useful task, through to superintelligence, generally defined as some orders of magnitude smarter than, or well, equal to or smarter than the collective of humanity, potentially, as you say, sort of 5,000 IQ plus. So,
I mean, not specifically, it's notional, but
no, sure. It's it gives people an idea of the sort of thing you're talking about. You're not talking about a bit smarter than Einstein. You're talking about sort of fantastically smarter. Let's talk about whether we get to superintelligence on the present pathway. First of all, I mean, large language models are the dominant approach at the moment. It seems they probably can't be scaled up indefinitely, but we have reasoning models now which break problems down into steps and follow logical chains of thought and are making considerable gains that way. We've got agentic AI, which can go away and do things on its own, at least in the digital realm. Another interesting paper, and I'm citing a lot of your work here, but it's you put out an extraordinary amount of really fascinating, game-changing work. The definition of AI, which came out,
or of AGI.
Of AGI. Yes, we know what AI means. That was relatively recent. You used something called the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory to benchmark cognition to the best human model. And I want to quote your conclusion that you posted on X from this paper. There are many barriers to AGI, but they each seem tractable. It seems like AGI won't arrive in a year, but it could easily this decade. Just explain that paper quickly and how you landed on that conclusion.
Yeah. So many people have been criticizing AIs can't do this, AIs can't do that. And I don't think that these are just people cherry picking things. They actually have a lot of limitations. And what we did was we were thinking, if we're treating AGI as something that's human level, it has the the cognitive versatility and proficiency of a well-educated adult. Well, what does that consist in? What are all the parts that you need? And there's a model of human intelligence, which is the main model used in a variety of fields, which is derived just from some basic statistical models, which would be CHC theory. It was developed over a century, and that identified various components of human intelligence. So, sort of rattling them off, there are 10. There's its visual abilities, its auditory abilities, that's its input. And then that's processed through its central executive abilities, which would be what's its general reasoning ability, what's its working memory, so short-term memory. Then from that, it may learn things, so it might store abilities and skills and knowledge into its long-term memory. So there's long-term memory storage, and that increases your store of knowledge, such as general knowledge and mathematical knowledge and things like your reading, writing ability, for instance. You also need the ability to retrieve those memories from your long-term memory. And finally, the 10th among those is what's your overall speed at doing all these operations? Does it take you a long time to read and write? Does it take you a long time to reason? Or are you fairly quick at it? So those are 10. And what we did was we just looked at where is AI in each of these dimensions. And we found that there are lots and lots of gaps. For reference, GPT-4, on a scale of 0 to 100, looking at these 10 axes, gets something like 27%. Meanwhile, GPT-5, because it has visual capabilities, because it can talk and listen, because it has a much larger working memory, and because it's much better at things like mathematics and also reading and writing, that it gets a lot higher. So it gets 57% accuracy instead. Now, that's only around half the way there. So there's still a lot to do. There's still a lot of capabilities it lacks. It, for instance, does not have continual learning ability. It does not have the ability to learn things from its day-to-day experiences. So it has current GPT models have amnesia. And this is one reason they're not very useful. It's very hard to employ somebody with amnesia. So you will always have to re-explain things to it again, or give it new context that a human wouldn't require. So that's a substantial limitation. So I think that's the main part that this sort of framework and model of human intelligence identifies as substantially lacking in current AI systems. But if we have a breakthrough there, then we've actually, I think, done the hardest part. Then we're just needing a lot of other business as usual research and development, like improving its visual capabilities, improving its audio capabilities, making its short-term memory somewhat better, and so on and so on. There's a bit to do for its reasoning abilities as well, even though that's fairly far along. So there's still some gaps, though. But the main thing, so I think it's basically one breakthrough in continual learning and long-term memory storage, and then a lot of business as usual engineering, which could take a few years. So that's, I think, what is between us and AGI.
I've got to say, I mean, that change from GPT-4 to GPT-5, I mean, in just a couple of years, I mean, it doubled from 27 to around 57. 57 doesn't sound too bad to me, even as a standalone thing. Look at my local shops, I think, who wouldn't quite get to 57%. That's of the average intelligent person, yeah?
Yeah, that's for well-educated. And so a lot of these abilities, what it means is that an average well-educated person is going to nail these questions, though. So this means it's actually missing a lot. Right. So it's very capable on some things, but it's not getting points if it's doing things way better than people. It only gets the points if it's at least at the level of people, but it's not getting extra bonus points. So it can't rack those up. The fact that it's so knowledgeable about so many different subjects doesn't particularly help it. It's just, is it more knowledgeable about things in total than like an average well-educated person? And the answer is yes, so it gets all those points. So it still lacks many basic bits of cognitive machinery. And so the critics who point out, like, look, it can't do this basic thing, can't do this basic thing. It's not just cherry picked. It's actually the case. They've got a lot of these issues. There's a lot to do. But for all that, I don't think that means that it's several decades away as a consequence. I think that if we look at the remaining components and look at the trend lines for those, looks like those will require quite a bit more work. But I don't see why it would necessarily take decades. I could easily see all of these being resolved by the end of the decade.
But it needs that breakthrough on retrieval, yes. Correct? So it needs long-term
or on long-term memory storage. It consolidating those things, consolidating its experiences into its mind. We don't have the equivalent, for instance, in AIs of dreaming. So that's like 1/3 of our day is dreaming, and they have nothing like that. That's where we learn from day-to-day experiences and learn to do things better in our head through dreams and whatnot. So since they don't have that functionality or anything analogous to it at all, I think that's a big chunk of what's missing.
So I mean, and this comes back to the post-training, pre-training thing. Basically, when a model is built, it's training weights, which are a little bit like the weights of the neurons in our brains, learning. Those are kind of more or less set down. The model doesn't fundamentally change over time through different experiences, correct? Whereas a human being, as we have experiences, our brain our neurons rewire based on those new experiences, and that's how we learn things. I mean, the dreaming thing is fascinating because that's when it actually all sort of gets bedded down in our sort of, as our brains kind of shut down. That is really interesting. Okay, so do we then need a fundamentally different architecture from LLMs in order to make this memory storage and retrieval breakthrough?
I would guess not. It's also very possible, like a lot of the AI companies are thinking that maybe they'll be able to get it in the next year or so. They're acting in some more bullish ways. They all have concerted projects for it. It's always harder to tell though, just because we don't have it yet, that maybe we would actually, but, personally, I would guess that, you don't need something that isn't deep learning. I would still expect it to be a deep learning system, and I would guess it probably still can be a transformer of some sort. The main issue is taking those experiences and taking the gist of those and learning from those without destroying the rest of its knowledge. That's kind of the issue, and doing that efficiently enough, so that it can learn just from a few experiences and get the gist of it and update itself accordingly. So those are some challenges, so that it doesn't forget lots of the other stuff that it used to know. Obviously, people forget some of that, but
the greatest ever line from the Simpsons. Homer Simpson says, "You know, Marge, when I can't learn new things. Remember when I learned how to use a computer, I forgot how to drive." It's brilliant.
We don't want catastrophic forgetting when it is doing that learning, right, which is a substantial challenge.
Okay. So, all right. Now, we've got a little bit of time left. I'll finish up in a moment, but I just want to get your thoughts on you've talked about recursion. So that's basically, AI is making better AIs, and that's the sort of, as you said, that's the goal that a lot of the all the AI labs fundamentally are going for. Does that mean once we get to AGI, we automatically quickly get to ASI beyond that? Because once you've got, you said yourself, you can copy this one smart AI, get it to do, make 100,000 copies of itself. Suddenly you automate all of this and it goes very, very quickly. Is that a sort of built-in assumption that you have?
So AGI itself doesn't necessarily do that. So you would need AGI plus specifically world-class AI research skills. So the definition of AGI that we were using was just the cognitive versatility and proficiency of a well-educated adult, not of a world-class AI researcher. So it may lack some specific economic skills, but if it can learn that, then you basically have this recursion be possible. And then that creates so much geopolitical uncertainty and instability that this will be a major global conversation far beyond what it is now. I should say that we'll have a paper out fairly soon as well, which gets at not just whether it's has the cognitive versatility and proficiency of well-educated adult, but instead, does it have a collection of all these additional economic skills? So we have a paper that'll be out soon called the Remote Labor Index. It should be available by the time this is public. This podcast is public. Where we're directly measuring the AI's automation rate of various different economic tasks. And we're currently finding it's something like 2.5% or so of the tasks it's able to automate. So in terms of economic traction, it's still not there. But we'll see how that evolves over time. So the main objective of that is let's just keep track of what the actual automation rate is when we're trying to see what the economic impacts and overall usefulness of these models are.
Great. We'll look out for that. Okay, one last one. I know you've got to go, but I'm just interested in your take on the degree to which we're very much in uncharted space here. We look for analogies. I talked about this on the podcast we did last week where we touched on this ASI. This superintelligence statement. But we instinctively look to history for analogies and for comparisons when we're in these sorts of discussions. And the nuclear one is a sort of a natural one because of, I suppose, the geopolitical arrangement. In this case, we have two superpowers, a little bit like we had then. We've got an enormously powerful technology that is still being explored and discovered. There's an obvious race around it. But you said yourself earlier in the conversation, it's not an adequate analogy, nuclear, because nuclear bombs can't make better nuclear bombs. That's a bit of a wrong. We don't have that.
They can't self-multiply.
Yeah, no, that's right. But also, things like if you're talking about deterrence and preventive action, when the US briefly had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, it could have bombed the crap out of the Soviet Union and ruined its chances of catching up. And I think, and as you've noted yourself, some surprising pacifists, including the philosopher Bertrand Russell, actually advocated for that because he thought it was the lesser of two evils, as opposed to getting into a nuclear arms race that would go on forever and could potentially destroy everybody. It's different for superintelligence because presumably you could non-kinetically disable somebody else's ability to catch up with you. You could do it through cyber means that you were talking about before. The moral and political cost would therefore be much, much lower, and therefore the geopolitical instability is possibly even greater than it was around the nuclear arms race or the standoff there. So just reflect for me a little bit as a way of closing on what it's like just sort of working in this completely uncharted space, at a time when, we're really looking at the creation of a technology that will change just everything. Our entire understanding of life on Earth and intelligence.
Yeah. So I think at a high level, this is the largest period or most salient period in human history, the development of AI. It could even be beyond, humans in some sense. Like this would be one of these, if you zoom out, like there's the transition from unicellular life to to multicellular life. Like that was a very big event. And also the emergence of not just from having just biological life to digital life is also a very big event on a cosmic scale. Now, for analogies, I think it's useful to think about AI not just as being analogous to nuclear weapons, but instead analogize it to potentially catastrophic dual-use technologies. So it's like bio, that's cyber, that's chem. And what properties are in those intersections? Well, we had agreements in all of those, international agreements in all of those. We wanted to keep those out of the hands of rogue actors for all of those. We in part deter particular usage for biochem and nuclear to varying extents. And we also use it for economic competitiveness. We use, I guess less for nuclear. It really depends. Sometimes there are nuclear power plants, but for bio and chem, we also use that to supercharge our economies. So there are some use cases we swear off. And so, and there are ways in which we use this dual use technology. So I think that's the most productive viewpoint, is analogizing it to that. It has lots of benefits. It has lots of risks. What is shared among the case of nuclear, chem, and bio? Another class of analogies I find very useful is thinking of AI systems as complex systems, not mechanical systems, but things that are more analogous to, or complex systems is what's the set of analogies that are useful for analyzing for analyzing complex systems. So it's a collection of a lot of things to look for, a lot of failure modes that tend to happen. And so I think those are probably the two most productive analogies. But I think making it be very specific and not abstracted, if you try and analogize it to global warming, what's the equivalent to the ozone layer, is tends not to be very productive. But when you do a little bit of abstraction or try to find what patterns hold in multiple different settings, then I think it becomes a lot easier to think about these issues.
Fantastic. All right. Look, I will let all of that sink in to our audience's heads. But look, Dan, I've been wanting to do this for a while. I'm very, very grateful you've made the time for us. I know how busy you are. You've got many roles and many hats that you wear. Keep up the great research. Keep up putting out the great papers, and we'll put some of those in our show notes. Dan Hendrycks, it's been a real pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is a good set of questions. Bye.
Thanks for listening, folks. We're going to be back later this week with another episode of Stop the World.